But I believe that by overwhelming majority in all the Americas, you and I, in the long run, and if it be necessary, you and I will act together to protect, to defend, by every means at our command.
Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where we discuss leaders, their decisions, and how they shape the world we live in today. Welcome to the History in Motion podcast. In today's episode, we embark on the extraordinary journey of one of history's most celebrated minds, Leonardo da Vinci. This is the first part of a two-part exploration into the life of a man who defined the Renaissance. Today, we'll dive into his early years, from his beginnings in Vinci to his rise as a promising artist and polymath in Florence. We'll uncover how his curiosity and apprenticeships shaped his path, laying the foundation for his revolutionary contributions to art, science, and engineering. Join us as we unravel the early life of the man who would become the quintessential Renaissance man. This is the History in Motion podcast.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the History in Motion podcast. And today I have put basically no effort into my intro because it's Leonardo da Vinci. I don't think I need to say any more about that. So yeah, we're gonna have a lot of fun with him today because, again, he is a man that needs no introduction. We're going to split this one into two parts as well because his life is in depth and has so many cool things to talk about. So today we're just going to start talking about him, his upbringing, his younger life, how he kind of became the man that he became, and then spend next time talking about when he really hits his strides and becoming this superstar artist, engineer, painter, whatever you want to call it. He kind of seemed to do it all, but that's how we're going to start today. But like I said, it's Leonardo da Vinci. I don't think I need to tell the audience much about who we're talking about today.
I think that's one of the things that kind of makes me nervous about this episode, right? Is that everyone knows who he is. And, you know, I promise we will try our best to do it justice, but there is no shortage of historical information available about him. It really just matters on what part of it you want to focus on.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what's so interesting about him, and I'm sure you felt this too, is I came in with, I knew a little bit about his art, a little bit about the work that he did, but I really didn't know much about him as a person, who he was, how he became who he became. And I think that's the story that we're most interested today. Like, yeah, he painted the Mona Lisa. It's very cool. And you can go, millions of people see it every year. But how does he get to that point? Or how does he get to painting something like The Last Supper? Or how do all these incredible sketches of the human body come to be? That's the story I think that I'm more interested in. But you're right. I think everyone comes into this with knowing a little bit about him and different things. And I don't think anybody comes into this knowing nothing about him, or at least some of his work, which I think makes it fun because there'll be certain pieces that I'm interested in talking about a little bit more because I had no idea about, but there's also some really cool stuff around, hey, he painted and did all these cool things, but how does someone get to the point to being so brilliant and so talented, especially when, sometimes we take genius for granted. Oh, he was born a genius and was so good, but it's that journey that I think makes things a little bit more interesting.
I think on that same point, before we get into the nitty gritty, I think I made this point when we were deciding whether to split this into 2 episodes or keep it one, which is something that I reflected on during the research, which is when I think of Da Vinci, I think of Da Vinci as an established artist, scientist, savant, of multiple streams. Whereas I think we did the right thing to kind of split the 2 episodes out so we can actually see the journey of how did he become the Da Vinci that we actually all know or think about when we hear his name.
It's funny you say that because as I was kind of doing the research and you kind of hearing about interactions and I'm picturing it in my head a little bit, I always had to keep reminding myself that, he's 20 years old. He doesn't have a long gray beard. That's just the picture of Da Vinci that I have in my head. And you're right. Like, we know who he is as an established person. We think of him as this stoic, deep thinker who's kind of, just very well established and almost has this reverence about him and this aura that, nobody else has ever come close to seeing, but he had to get there. Something had to happen to get him there. And it wasn't necessarily, from the moment he started painting, he was a success. There's a lot of ups and downs in his life until he gets to the point, not only where he's confident with his own skills, but he finds patrons in an environment where he can really thrive in the way that Leonardo needs. Because I think the biggest thing with Leonardo, as we'll see, is a lot about the environment and the people around him, more so than who he is as a person. He needs both of those to be in sync because unfortunately for Leonardo, he likes things in a certain way. He's very particular about certain things. If someone's not willing to give him that freedom, he's going to get bored, he's going to get distracted, and he's not really going to succeed in the ways that he wants and the people who are, paying him ultimately. So we'll see a lot of that as we go through his life.
Yeah, I think the childhood and like the journey of how, we'll get into it. I think we can start the story before we get do a little bit too much discussion about his childhood, because I think there's some interesting narratives we'll go down. Definitely, yeah.
So let's just start with Leonardo himself. So he was born on April 15th, 1452 in a small town of Vinci. So it's a little town in the Tuscan countryside within the sphere of influence of Florence, which is a republic/city-state. He was the illegitimate son of Piero da Vinci, who was a wealthy notary, and his mother was a peasant woman named Caterina. So right away, he's not born into a world where he's going to be able to necessarily go down his father's path due to his illegitimacy. He's 3 years younger than Lorenzo de' Medici. So to kind of put things in context, he's born kind of around the same time and, born in a town of Vinci, Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo is his first name, and then Vinci is just saying, he's of Vinci. But being illegitimate is key for him because it definitely had challenges in those days. It's not in the sense that, in some periods in history where if you were illegitimate, that's it. Like there was nothing you could do. You're basically going to be a laborer. You're not going to be able to get educated. You don't have the family name to really back you up. And in Renaissance Florence, you're kind of somewhere in between. So he's definitely not going to be able to follow in his father's footsteps and become a notary in that sort of profession. But he was able to still get educated and still live a normal life. He's definitely not shunned from society for being illegitimate, but there's definitely some challenges, with being that. But ultimately, this is probably the greatest thing that's ever happened to Leonardo, because if he was legitimate, he probably would have became a notary. He probably would have been in a very constrained environment where, you're a notary. There's rules that have to be followed. But now Leonardo's able to be born and he doesn't have these formal obligations. He has these degrees of freedom to pursue his interests. And that's really rare in 15th century Italy. So you have to remember, like I said, if he was born legitimate, probably becomes a notary. But also, this is not a world where most people can just enjoy themselves and be curious and live life. Day to day is still a bit of a struggle. Maybe you're a farmer and you need to continuously have food and provide for your family. You're working really long hours. And it's not really a time when you can kind of explore things. So he's born into a relatively wealthy family, but he's not being forced to follow in those footsteps. So he has a little bit of backing and some connections, and he's able to kind of do what he wants. And for someone like Leonardo, and we'll see how his mind works, that is the perfect setup for him, despite the fact that being illegitimate might be seen as a negative.
One of the really interesting things about what you just said, and I think this is a topic we'll probably discuss in a bit more detail in the second episode, but this whole idea of if your father's a notary, you're going to be a notary, your son's going to be a notary. There's something very distinctive about the Renaissance, and the power of self-agency. It's really a theme that kind of comes out as we'll see in Leonardo's life as him being, very typical of what we would think of as a Renaissance man. And here is someone who, has the opportunity because, to a certain degree, there is this kind of openness that's there within this broader kind of cultural backtext of the Renaissance, and how, he's able to kind of explore some other options outside of being, very narrowly defined by what his father's done as his career.
You're absolutely right. And if this is 100, 200 years ago, this might have been an unthinkable thing where you're going to go get a certain type of job and you're going to do it well. And that's just the way it's going to be. And you're right. The Renaissance, especially Florence, it's allowing people to flourish in different ways. And the cultivation of art and of just culture itself is really changing. And we've talked about this when we did our episode on Lorenzo de' Medici and Machiavelli. And, a lot of people talk about history and they say, you look throughout history and you say the 20th century, New York City was probably the city to be in culturally. And if you look at the 19th century, it was probably Paris. Talk about the 15th century, it's probably Florence, just based on how much things are changing. And you're right that he's able to be born into this world with a little bit of the freedom to kind of do what he wants. It is kind of very rare and almost probably part of the reason we're talking about Leonardo to begin with. He was born 100 years earlier. Who knows where, he would have been. But, he goes on with his life. And one of the things that's key is he's not educated in the traditional sense through reading classical texts in Latin or reading the classics like a typical Florentine person would be when they get educated. So again, another hidden blessing for him, because he's not following these traditional scholarly pursuits. He develops this visual and experimental approach to learning, really relying on empirical observation and hands-on exploration. So he's not being told what to think, just going out and kind of experiencing the world. And if you really think of, what is science in the most traditional sense, it's observing things and forming conclusions based on those observations. And so that's really what he starts. And we have to remember at this time, science isn't really defined in the same way. Like Galileo kind of defines that 100 years later. So he's kind of starting this almost naturally scientific curiosity, with himself. So he's really focused on seeing the world around him. He's obsessed with nature. He loves sketching plants, animals, the landscapes. He has this really deep fascination with just the mechanics of nature. So not just, hey, there's a tree, but how do the leaves rustle in the wind? How does the water move through a stream? Why does it fall in a certain way over a waterfall versus why does it stay still within a pond? And, if something flies into the pond, what are those ripples doing? How are they moving? And he just gets so deep into this. And so we're going to reference him a lot during this episode because his work on Leonardo has been so great, and that's Walter Isaacson. And so Walter Isaacson has a really great way of putting this. He says, Leonardo had an intense curiosity about the world around him, one that was fueled by his childhood. He developed a habit of questioning everything he saw and sought to understand how things work, but just not on the surface, but like deep within. So think of like, you're a little kid, you're asking, why is the sky blue? And then someone would answer. He's going 3, 4, 5 levels deeper, and he's really asking a lot of these questions, but I almost see him stopping at the pure philosophical. He wants to really understand it from a scientific perspective. He doesn't necessarily need to know the why. He needs to know the how, and he needs to understand how they all kind of integrate together. And that's really, I think, where Leonardo spends the most of his life as a child. And it's kind of fueled by, he's growing up in one of the most beautiful areas in the world and really taking all of that in. And you will start to see how that comes out, in his artwork.
I think one of the things that really stands out about this whole sentiment about when he's born, his early childhood, intention with curiosity and just trying to figure things out. It's almost so timely in many ways when you're talking about science, technology, and exploration at this point. So in 1450, the printing press is made and available. Christopher Columbus, who's born in 1451, is within 1 year of Leonardo's birth. And then the Renaissance on a higher, more broader level is kind of challenging these traditional ideas as well from like pure scientific inquiry. So you can see the foundation being laid for a pretty transformative era that he's, born into without knowing. In some ways, he kind of won there's like the birth lottery, but like the cultural birth lottery, because what he's about to see change is so massively different than anyone that has come before him.
It's quite the decade. I didn't realize that with Columbus, Lorenzo de Medici, Leonardo da Vinci all being born within a few years of each other. You're right. It is some sort of it's a turning point in human history. And you're right. It's almost a bit of I wouldn't say necessarily a lottery, but maybe to an extent where, he's born in the perfect time to be Leonardo da Vinci. He's not going to be Leonardo da Vinci in any other time, but he's also got to be Leonardo da Vinci to be Leonardo da Vinci, which sounds a little bit silly, but he has to have both to kind of make this work. And I think that's such a great way of putting it, is this is such a transformative time where he's able to do some of these things. And the fact that a Christopher Columbus and a Lorenzo de Medici are born within the same decade just tells you enough about the types of opportunities that are available for people who are, born into the Medici, for example, or born in a small town, in a little countryside. So yeah, it's very interesting how that all kind of comes together. And, with coming back to his life, this fact of just this nature kind of coming back into his scientific works, like we talked about, interest in water, but wind and even light. And that's so key when we start to think about artwork, right? Is how do you create a painting where light is hitting the objects in a certain way that looks realistic and really makes those areas pop in a certain way. And so he's so obsessed with just watching the way light is interacting off things. How does shadows form and all of these things? And so he's just so keen on this side of nature, but he's also the ultimate people watcher. He loves to just sit and watch. He loves to not just see who people are as they're walking around, but he wants to see how they interact. How do they react when someone tells them something funny or tells them something sad? How does their face move? How does their eyes change? How do you capture emotion on someone's face with, not being able to hear them? And again, you start to see some of these in his early sketches where he's just sketching people that he sees. And this is so huge into his way of doing things. But this all kind of culminates in, he's just doing sketches, he's just doing little things, but this really culminates in a story that's told by one of Leonardo's earliest biographers, where a story goes that a local peasant himself a shield, and he went to Leonardo's father and he said, I'd like you to paint this for me. Piero gives it to Leonardo, and Leonardo is inspired by the story of Medusa, which is the Greek story with the beast with the snakes for hair, and if you look at her, you turn into stone. So he makes this beautiful painting of this monster spitting fire that apparently was so terrifying that his father went out and bought another shield, gave that to the peasant, and then sold the shields for 100 ducats to a Florentine art dealer, who eventually sold it to the Duke of Milan. So again, we think this is true, but also there's a little bit of a, hey, look how great Leonardo is as a young age. But he's clearly got not just an innate talent, but just to be able to portray this emotion and certain levels of grandeur on this painting at such a young age. You can tell there's a lot of skill here and a lot of talent, and we're about to see his father recognizes that he recognizes it, and then it's time to move off to the big city and really start kicking into high gear his art career.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I really took away specifically from this chapter of his life was that kind of artistic inclination that's matched to his scientific curiosity. Sometimes you see like one or the other, right? To see a combination of both with such an early level of like mastery with his inquisitive thinking and his ability to actually draw beautiful sketches at such an early age. And given what we know about him in the future and his focus on trying to create applications and machinery, this whole engineering feat, it's such an interesting foreground for an early Da Vinci to see what it's going to transform into.
Absolutely. And I think I was just thinking of like, how did he know he was good at doing what he was doing? How did he get so good at just sketching? But I think for him, we've clearly seen he has such an eye for understanding the world and seeing things in different ways and how things interact. And I'm sure he must have been such a perfectionist with his drawings, basically saying, hey, well, the water didn't do that this time, so I must have done something wrong. Okay, let's try it again. Or, the shadows moved in a different way, or now I'm looking at the tree in a different way and the shadows are doing something different, or the colors have changed and I need to make an update. And so you can just see this almost obsession with potentially getting better and better. But, he's clearly able to do things at a level that no one's really expecting him to do. But he's moving to Florence now. And like you mentioned, Richie, this is not just some city. This is the cultural center of the world, potentially at this point. This is an area where things are opening up. There's so many opportunities in the art space. And, with Leonardo's talent, it makes perfect sense for, him to try to move to the big city.
Yeah, this is like the epicenter. I'd even go as far as saying the birthplace of the Renaissance. Right, which is, there's a degree of focus on the classical text, classical learning, artistic innovation, humanism. You have icons like Dante, Michelangelo, and eventually Leonardo, who kind of began their careers here or are able to flourish in the society. And it's not just the epicenter it is the epicenter of the Renaissance, but on top of that too, there is this cultural flourishing that's happening at the time within this period. And that's why there's such a high priority on things like the arts, philosophy, literature. It is really this cultural epicenter of Europe at this point that focuses on intellectual exploration. So, the very ideals and interests that Da Vinci embodies is embodied by Florence, the city-state. So it's a perfect coming together of two forces that are really gonna, cultivate that curiosity and talent that, came so naturally to Leonardo.
And it's almost like this kind of crossover too, right? Of you have the artistic side, but you almost have this like scientific philosophy that's starting to almost get merged with kind of modern science. And you're almost kind of seeing this transformation away from just thinking about the way the world works and actually going and doing some different things with it. And then you have all the interesting engineering. But you're right, it's all kind of culminating in this one city, in this one valley in the middle of Tuscany. And again, it's just so perfect for someone like Leonardo for now. We'll see how that changes. But I think it's really interesting just how lucky it is that, he's able to make his way there, and he's going to find no shortages of opportunities. So he gets to Florence and he's only 14. So that's the most important thing. He isn't going away for university or anything like that. He's a kid. And he moves to Florence. And at this point, his father's able to get him an apprenticeship in the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio. And so Verrocchio is a very prominent artist in Florence. And so he comes into this workshop, but this isn't, and this is something that I really took away that was really interesting. This wasn't just a workshop where you learn how to paint. This is a workshop where I would call it like a center of innovation. This is a group of incredibly smart people, incredibly talented people who are interested in pretty much everything. So he's not just learning how to paint. He's learning how to make sculptures. He's learning how to do metalworking. He's learning some engineering, and he's even experimenting a little bit with just the mechanics of how things work. And so like I just mentioned, like there's a change happening here where some of these artists are kind of blending into being scientists at the same time. And, we have a whole bunch of changes happening with Leonardo, but, we even look at 100 years earlier when the dome in Florence was first created. Was a very long problem that nobody could figure out, and it fell to Brunelleschi. And Brunelleschi definitely had his artistic side, but he also had this huge engineering side to it. And so right away, Leonardo's looking up to somebody like Brunelleschi and saying, he was able to build this dome. What technique, what talent, but it also is a beautiful dome. He's able to put his artistic side into it because he understands the engineering of it. So that's really the type of person that Leonardo's trying to grow into. And this workshop is a perfect place for that because they're just trying a bunch of different things out. They're obviously painting a lot and they're learning a lot of those things, but he's doing all these other things. And this is pretty typical of an apprenticeship in Florence at this time. So it's a typical apprenticeship. It's a multi-year process where you're being trained as a young artist in the technical and practical aspects of art making, but you're under the guidance of a master. So typically you wouldn't have been paid for something like this, but you'd be given a room to stay and you'd be given food by the master. And it's kind of a traditional master and apprentice sort of setup. So he's starting with menial tasks like grinding pigment, preparing materials, and probably just sweeping up when he needs to. And the apprentices like Leonardo, they slowly graduate to copying work, studying perspective, anatomy, and contributing to their master's commissions by painting minor elements. But ultimately, these are vibrant communal workspaces where they're taking in everything around, not just the artistic side, but the business side of things. They're seeing people come in and negotiate for commissions. They're seeing people come in with cultural elements of, hey, this is what I want to see. But then you also just see people coming in and talking about their problems and different people coming in and out. And you're constantly feeding off these essentially superstars of the artistic world and really growing as a group. And so I think, again, this is really, Leonardo doesn't go to university where he's able to study things in a scholarly way, but he's able to come together with like minds and really kind of go through this experimentation process, but then also get more of a classical training in art and sculpting and other things that he'll potentially work on.
I think that's one of the most important takeaways, not just about Da Vinci and, his childhood and the education that he got, because it was, transformative, but just it's such a great symbol of the Renaissance as well. Like the multi-disciplinary nature of this type of apprentice system. It's drawing, painting, sculpture, technical design. And this all really depends on the, master's expertise that you're working with. And Verrocchio himself, I think he was a sculptor and a goldsmith at some point, right? So he has a diverse background too. And I think this is one of those really interesting takeaways because it's going to train you in such a way where you can look and analyze problems from so many different perspectives versus, how we do it today with a very high degree of specialization. And I think this is one of those really cool dynamics of the Renaissance itself and how it kind of promotes this multi-level, multi-angled way of thinking, almost this 360 approach.
Absolutely. And you talked about earlier, like he is the Renaissance man. There's so many people around him who are Renaissance men, but ultimately they don't know how to do a lot of the things that they're trying to do. They're just trying to figure it out. And I think that what makes this time period so interesting is, there's no book on the engineering of building a dome until Brunelleschi figures out how to do it. There's no book on how to build the perfect canal, the perfect dam, and Leonardo will start to challenge some of those assumptions. And nobody knows how the human body really works either. And Leonardo will get into figuring that out. So a lot of it is just this experimentation, and there's little pieces that you could read in a classical way, but ultimately this is an education by fire. Really, it's trial and error, trial and error, trial and error, and you just keep going until you can figure some things out. But ultimately you have a guide and you have people working with you who can criticize you and support you in different ways. And we start to see very clearly that Leonardo's got a special gift, and his mind and his ability to really see things is very important. So this apprenticeship not only was the perfect environment, but Verrocchio himself, he's all about observation and experimentation. And so I think that's why him and Leonardo work so well together, and he was able to thrive in that space. He's learning the importance of precision, perspective, and the interplay of light and shadow that really define a lot of his masterpieces as he goes throughout his career. So he's really understanding those technical disciplines, but he's also learning about hydraulics, mechanics, how things are moving around the world physically. And not only is that important for his scientific discoveries, but we're going to continue to talk about this as by understanding the world, everything that he does has a direct influence on his art. And I remember reading something about he would criticize artists who would make the muscles pop in their paintings. And I think this might have been a little bit of a shot at Michelangelo, but he was basically saying, well, muscles don't do that. He goes, when you watch somebody run, he goes, their muscles will pop when they're planting or they're running off their foot. When they're standing there, their shoulder and arm muscles aren't popping. And he was so concerned about capturing the realism of this. And so we'll start to see a lot of that as he goes along. But really his first contribution to Verrocchio's work, we believe there may have been some smaller things, but what we know for sure is he created this angel in a painting called The Baptism of Christ. And you look at this angel and you can tell right away that this isn't just some kid from some little town. This is somebody who's got a lot of talent. And the angel was rendered so beautifully and had such grace and had just had this expression on it that really kind of spoke to a lot of people who looked at it. And on top of that, Leonardo had done some work in the background too, on top, to kind of do some of the landscape work, which again, you can already see a little bit of that. You can tell what he does just based on the level of detail and how he does things. And so this angel was considered to be so impressive. And there's a definitely not true story. I'm sure there's some version of this where Verrocchio looked at the angel and said, I can never paint again because this is such an incredible thing and I will never come up to the level of this young kid. Definitely not true in its fullest sense, but he may have said, oh, wow, I got some work to do. This kid's the real deal. But again, this is the first time where I think we have some physical evidence to say, yeah, at a young age, Leonardo is really showing his skill and there's a bright future for him.
I'm definitely not a art history expert by any stretch of the imagination, nor an art expert at all. But, when I was reading this story, and I don't think we've chatted about it yet, I looked up the painting and I was wondering to myself as I was looking it up, would I be able to tell immediately which angel or side that Leonardo was, responsible for doing? And instantaneously, you could tell. Like, it is instantaneous, even for someone like myself with an absolutely untrained art eye. It's a stark difference. And I would urge our listeners to Google some of the paintings that we're going to discuss, because I think talking about it doesn't do it justice, because the beauty and level of detail and the realism that he's able to capture in these paintings is incredible.
Yeah. And you even see like little things in that painting where it's like the way the cloth falls on the ground and kind of crumples up. And there's some talk that he did some of the ripples in the water around Christ's feet. And you can just tell that like this is something that a lot of people hadn't seen before, just because someone who understands the physical world so well. But, he's just getting started with this, but this really just shows, how talented he is. And I think to your point, Richie, we are not art experts in the slightest, but if we can tell, I think we can say that, he's a pretty talented guy for being such a young man at this, or a young boy really at this point. One of the other things that he does at this time is he makes this really beautiful sketch of the Arno Valley. So the Arno Valley is basically the valley that Florence is situated in. The Arno River goes through the city of Florence. And it's really the first time that anyone's really done just a picture of nature. There's not a lot of that. A lot of the paintings at this time are deeply religious in some way, or of portraits of people. People aren't really capturing nature in the same way that they are. And so you can already start to see his interest shifting a little bit to, I want to capture just nature. I don't want to necessarily do these types of paintings all the time. And it's just another part to show a little bit of his range, where he's able to create this beautiful angel in this very religious moment, but also just capture just an everyday overview of the Arno Valley.
Yeah, I was quickly looking it up while you were talking about it, and I found some images of his early sketches that he's known to have drawn before his return to his hometown. And just even like the level of detail in his sketches is incredible. I'm so envious just looking at it, because I have absolutely no aptitude for creating things like this. It's incredible what he was able to do. And what's he, 14 at this time? 16?
So yeah, somewhere in between probably 14 and 20. So he's definitely a young man at this point, and we don't know for sure where some of these sketches are. Could even have been from before he moved to Florence. He could have been even younger, but yeah, mostly probably in his teen years that he's doing a lot of these things. So
it's incredible.
Yeah, exactly. And you can really see the talent coming out, and especially for a time when, new things like perspective are just starting. It seems to be almost things he's capturing naturally a little bit and then really refining as he's working with Verrocchio. So he's been doing his work with Verrocchio for a while. He's been he's painting these angels. People are starting to realize that he's got some talent, and he turns 20 and he's now officially done his training, and he's listed as a master in the Florence's Guild of St. Luke, which allowed him to accept commissions independently. So his first commission is he was to work on the altarpiece in the Palazzo Vecchio, which is the seat of the Florentine government. But this is where the classic Leonardo story begins. His first commission, he never completed it, and a bunch of people angry with him that he wasn't able to finish it because he just either he's going to do something else or it wasn't going in the way that he liked, and he just abandoned his work. And we'll see throughout his life, this is a chronic problem of Leonardo. He starts these things, agrees to things, gets about halfway through, and then says, forget it, I'm going to go do something else. So, not a great start to his professional career, but this is kind of what you get with working with a genius sometimes, is you don't get maybe hey, I'll pay you this, give me something in a year, and we'll call it a day.
Yeah, I think it's the trade-off we often talk about in episodes like this, right? With people or, actors from history who have just a level of genius that is beyond most people's understanding. And I think this is thematic of what we talked about in previous episodes, but, just as thematic for what this is going to look like later in the road. And it's just that trade-off between, genius, creativity, and curiosity. His brain probably goes in a million different directions at any one point in time if he's curious about something. So I can see, his notebooks are legendary in terms of the sketches and interests that he had. I think there's a story from his later life where he spent 50 hours just looking at a frog and just trying to sketch it out.
Yeah, it'd be very on brand, right? And you're right. Like, this isn't, he's going off and trying to take another commission and make a little bit more money or anything. It's, no, he found a frog and he wanted to sketch it. So he spent, 3 days doing that. It didn't work on the commission that he was working on, because he gets deeply, deeply into things. And like we mentioned, Walter Isaacson's quote at the beginning of, he doesn't want to just see it on the surface. He really wants to understand the deep elements of it. And that could even be the inner workings of how does a frog's heart work? Or, how does a frog jump so high with such small legs? And, all of these things. Like, those are questions that, he's going to start asking. But as we move on in his life, one of the earliest works that, again, survives things that we know about is a painting called the Annunciation. And so this is a painting of an angel and the Virgin Mary in a detailed landscape. And it's really interesting because you can really see his with perspective here and trying to, really build in this background and really have Mary and the angel, in the foreground. And he's doing some different things with colors that from some art historians are saying is really impressive for the time. So that's kind of one piece that he does. But the one that I really like is he does a portrait of someone named Ginevra de' Banchi, and she's a young Florentine noblewoman. Nothing too interesting about the painting itself, but what I love about it is you kind of just see this kind of standard portrait, but it has this like tie-in with nature in the background. There's this tree and this almost like melds in with her face kind of almost melds into this whole, I guess, naturalistic background. And I think it's just very, very cool. And it's actually located in the National Art Gallery in Washington, D.C. So it's close for some of our North American listeners. But I think it's just what goes to show, like, why does something like the Mona Lisa get so much praise? It's just a picture of someone. And we see these portraits where he's able to capture somebody, but he's able to do so much with the surrounding that it really makes this painting, a little bit special. Yeah, that was an interesting thought that I had too, relative to all the other works that I have looked at since starting research on this episode. I've seen the Mona Lisa. Well, it was surrounded by a crowd of 100 people, so I didn't really get to see it. But I don't know. There's so many other great works. I enjoy looking at his sketches the most. I think those, the ones that still exist and have been confirmed to be his, those like really showcase the inner workings of such a curious genius who's willing to go whichever. And I did look it up while you were chatting quickly because I don't like giving misinformation on this podcast. It was a frog. He was very interested in their anatomy. Yeah, not surprising. And if you said he's interested in anything, I probably would. It's probably true. But I like where you're going with that, because I think you get to see a little bit of his methods when you look at some of these sketches and unfinished work. And I think one of the ones that really was interesting was he has this painting that was unfinished called The Adoration of the Magi. And it's a huge kind of work, tons of people in it, horses, all of these sort of things. And he doesn't finish it. And again, that definitely doesn't help his cause in Florence. But what I think is so interesting about it is you can start to see within the sketch itself all the detail that he's putting in. And the way people talk about his work is you can tell that he's trying to think of, okay, well, how would this horse be reacting to this situation? Or how would this person be reacting to this person doing this? Okay, but I've painted in this person. So now this person has to react in a different way. And okay, now I know how they're going to react. How should their face look? How should their muscles look? Should this person be skinny? Should they be a little bit more well-fed? How should their face look from a color perspective? And you can just start to see how obsessive he got. And he's definitely a perfectionist. And so you can start to see within this painting or sketch, I guess, at this point, that there's just an unbelievable level of detail that he's trying to put into his work, and, getting to a point where he maybe thinks this is not even possible and he's ready to move on to something else. But I think that's a perfect kind of segue, I think, to what you were saying is, these sketches, you really get to show what he's interested in and why he's, maybe not necessarily able to finish a lot of these things, but it kind of shows the method to his madness a little bit.
I think on the whole idea of the method to his madness, another great segue, is how these paintings kind of bring together this very multidisciplinary approach. Just looking at what some art historians have said about his works, and some of the themes that really stuck out to me were, he's able to use like very technical approaches. To your point, he's very interested in the depth of human behavior, right? He's trying to include the psychological insight of how people are going to interact within these portraits or paintings that he's drawing. And then there's also this naturalistic approach for making things look as natural and as realistic as possible. And it's really bridging the gap between, I think, what art historians show as like traditional styles of the early Renaissance and the very, I guess, like emotionally rich and advanced works of the high Renaissance. And this is kind of a split that happens in the art history.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting as you see him even moving through his career, like how things are starting to change a little bit with kind of the work that he's doing. And I'm sure a lot of the work, actually, I know a lot of the work that he did was eventually captured later after he died, and work was put together to kind of explain to future artists, hey, here's how Leonardo would paint, and here's all the things that he used, right? So it's definitely a bit of that melding, and I think you can start to see the influence on, how he moved on with his life. But, really this is, we're seeing Leonardo's genius just because he's able to combine so many different things, like kind of a vision of what his patron wants or he wants, and being able to imagine what would actually be happening, and then kind of ground that all in reality and kind of link all three of those together. And I think that's what kind of makes him, so good at what he's able to do. So that's Leonardo from a technical, artistic perspective, but we really haven't got into who he was as a person. And so I mentioned off the top of this where I'm telling these stories and I'm trying not to picture him sitting there with his hat and his big long white beard and long white hair. He's 20, 25 at this time. He's a young man. And so we have that thought of, old stoic Leonardo sitting and sketching and painting and kind of keeping to himself and just being in solitude all the time. But really that could not be farther from the truth. He definitely, would go and sketch and spend time with himself, but he was actually known for being very funny. He's a very warm person and very charming person. And so anything that people wrote about him, like contemporaries that met him or spent time with him, really universally speak very positively about him. They just keep talking about how funny he was. That's one thing. They just keep saying he's just a fun person to be around. He's very funny, very warm, and he's just the person that's interesting to talk to. And he's one of those people who he liked to talk to everybody. He would go talk to some guy in the street, or he would go and speak to a really highly educated scholar, and he would really sit and listen and learn from these people in whatever way they wanted to share their stories. And I think that you see that in his art, because he's not able to just capture human emotions within his circle. He's able to capture emotion throughout all the different types of people that he meets. And so he really is this person who's kind of a little bit larger than life in some cases, and definitely likes his solitude, definitely likes to sit down and dissect a frog and learn a little bit about it. But he's not someone who's so introverted that he's pulling himself away and really just doesn't want to deal with people. He's actually quite a social person.
I think we often see sometimes the opposite with people who are very high in intelligence. But I think what sets Leonardo apart in terms of what we've talked about so far is just that overall sense of curiosity to understand things. And I think a part of that's people, where he's probably using some of that curiosity, or he's just curious about the people he's working around with in this Florentine circle at this point in his life. And he's rubbing shoulders with the who's who of Florentine elite as well. So it's not like he's just talking to peasants from from his town of Vinci. These are people he can learn from. There's this aspect of almost like peer and mentorship. I know we already talked about Verrocchio, but it was one of the themes that kind of stuck out to me. And I think it kind of circles back to your point in terms of this level of curiosity. He's surrounded by people that he's going to learn from. He's probably already respected as a polymath at this point, I imagine, with his very diverse set of skills, but it's still an opportunity to network, work with his peers, and this degree of mentorship.
Absolutely. And he's even starting to learn a little bit about mathematics and how that can bring, work into his art. But I think most importantly, right, is I don't think he's doing it in a selfish way by any sense of the imagination. Like, I'm going to go meet people so I can learn about them and be better at art. I think he's just so genuinely curious about everything that he wants to talk to different people. And that kind of resonates so much, within his artistic side of things. But there are some sacrifices I think he makes to be a little bit more unconventional. Yeah, he's very charming and very warm, but ultimately he's someone who kind of defied the societal norms at the time. So he was never married, never had any children. And Walter Isaacson actually has a really good way of framing this. He says, Leonardo probably did this as a deliberate choice to allow him to focus on his work and his passions. So instead, Leonardo's forming really close relationships, unconventional, which we'll get into in a second, with a small group of friends, patrons, assistants, people who are really close in his life. And that's where he's getting the social elements of his life and, those types of relationships, not necessarily through, a traditional family setup. But this is definitely kind of that balance I think that he can have where, he's definitely not committed to certain things that maybe might hold him back from, pursuing what he wants. But ultimately, he's human at the end of the day, and he finds those relationships in some different ways. Yeah,
and I think I know where you're going with your next point, but I think those unconventional relationships almost land him in some very hot water.
Yes, he does get into a little bit of trouble. So it's not 100% confirmed, but it's pretty much confirmed that Leonardo was definitely a gay man. He was arrested actually in 1476 on sodomy charges, which were eventually dismissed. And that's kind of where we get a little bit of evidence that he may have been a gay man. And part of that is he was actually listed if you go back to the actual charges, you can see his name on there. It was eventually dropped. And that's the thing with Renaissance Florence, is definitely conservative from a Christian perspective, but this kind of stuff, it was more of a hit and miss on whether they were actually going to enforce it or not. So something like this was thrown out. But, one of the most significant figures in his life is his assistant. So a man named Gian Giacomo Caprotti, who's better known as Salai, joins Leonardo's workshop and begins working with him. But right away, Salai is almost impossible to manage. He's incredibly mischievous, and he's just somebody who sounds like Leonardo wouldn't get along with, but there's a very, very strong possibility that their relationship was deeply romantic. And, we don't know conclusively, because the thing with Leonardo is he never wrote about himself. All of this is kind of conjecture from the outside, but it's pretty likely that they had a deep romantic relationship, especially the fact that Salai followed Leonardo around, when he moved to Milan and to other cities. Salai is there with him for most of his life. So, there's definitely more to just, hey, this is some assistant. And Leonardo didn't get married, but he has somebody in his life who, he can be very, very close with from an emotional perspective.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I'm reading here that Salai remained with Leonardo for almost 30 years, accompanying him during his travels in France. And I guess they were so close that when Da Vinci died, he actually left a portion of his vineyards to him, which obviously indicates a very strong bond.
Yeah, absolutely. This is definitely not just a friend. I think there's more to it, and you can see there's some rumors that some of the paintings that he's done were actually modeled off him. And yeah, you can definitely see a little bit of there's more here. But again, Leonardo never writes down my love for Salai or anything like that, and we just have to kind of put two and two together, just because Leonardo didn't write about himself very much. But it's pretty much most historians believe that yes, he was definitely a gay man, and Salai and Leonardo were most likely romantically together. So that's kind of who he is a little bit as a from his romantic side of things. But we don't know really much about him from his writing, but we do know again what people are saying about him. And his physical appearance I thought was interesting, as people said he had this striking appearance. He had incredible grooming. He was tall, long hair with a beard that kind of became his signature look. He always dressed very elegantly, bright, flamboyant colors, which really kind of made him stand out. And, his presentation reflected his artistic sensibility and his desire to express himself individually. So, he's an artist. He's gonna kind of fall into the stereotype of an artist who's, not following the rules of society, maybe in that sense. And he's kind of just doing his own thing and really just trying to be, growing as an individual and expressing himself in that way. And then the other thing that he does that's really unconventional is he was a vegetarian. So he is very unusual for this time, especially when finding food is already tough enough as it is, very untraditional for someone to be a vegetarian. But, this really kind of makes sense, right? He has this deep love for nature, deep love for animals. This comes from most likely a love for animals and not wanting to, hurt them in some way by being a non-vegetarian. So again, we can see him already starting to push things in a little bit of a different way. But, this is Leonardo, right? He's going to express himself in a whole bunch of different ways, and his food choices, his clothes, his hair, it's not totally different than what we'd see today, but that's the Leonardo of those years.
I think that's such an important insight, right? And I think this, if we kind of take it up a few steps, the backdrop of this happening in Florence is so important, right? I think you started off the podcast so eloquently when you mentioned, like, if you were going to, be born in a certain decade, there's certain cities that you think about. And I think for this era, where else could someone with Leonardo's curiosity and kind of penchant for pushing traditional bounds, where else could he really do this and be able to do it with some sense of security and freedom?
Absolutely. And especially think of someone like Leonardo and say he was born in Madrid. This is, the Inquisition is about to start. There's really push for traditional Catholic values. We don't really see as much of that in Florence. And eventually Savonarola comes around and changes that up a little bit as things get a little bit too non-traditional in his eyes. But at this point in time, this is perfect for Leonardo, we think, right? We think Leonardo's in the perfect spot. Why would he ever leave Florence? This is perfect. He's starting to really get unsettled by the time he's into his mid to late 20s. He's really getting frustrated at limited opportunities that he's getting for a couple of reasons. One, he's annoyed a lot of people because he's not finishing anything. So now he's got a bit of a reputation that, Leonardo's amazing if you can get him to actually finish these things. So that's one thing. Two, it's incredibly competitive. There's only so many people with money, and Florence is turning out incredible artists like they're going out of style. So like Verrocchio's still there, Botticelli's really big. You'll see Michelangelo come later in life. He's quite a bit younger actually than Leonardo, so he's not a direct competitor at this point. Just to give you an idea of the powerhouses that are coming out here, and there's a huge list of all these incredible artists that are coming out of Florence, and there's only so many patrons with deep pockets that are willing to pay for the type of things that need to be done. So he might be stuck doing portraits and other things that he doesn't really want to do. So he's kind of unsettled and he doesn't really know what he wants to do. And the thing with Florence too is it's culturally conservative in a sense. So it's very open with all the new things that they're letting people do. But ultimately, most of the commissions are very religious in nature. So he's being asked to, paint the same types of paintings a lot of the times or do things that other people have done with his own spin on it, which he's very good at doing. But at the same time, he wants to explore other things. He wants to do engineering type work. He wants to look at the human body. He wants to paint different things, not necessarily paint, pictures of Jesus in different areas and paint things in churches. This is a little bit different for him. So he eventually decides that he's going to leave Florence in 1482 with a group of ambassadors sent to Milan on behalf of Lorenzo de' Medici. So he's about to enter the service of Ludovico Sforza, who's the Duke of Milan. But there's one thing he does before he leaves, and we don't know if this letter was ever sent. It's 50-50 if he ever did. But he writes basically a resume. He writes out all these things and he goes, basically, Mr. Sforza, here's the things that I can do. He goes, I can design bridges for you. I can design siege weapons. I can even design armored vehicles. Basically, I can build tanks for you. He goes, I can give you methods to divert rivers and improve your water systems. I can construct nearly indestructible tunnels that you can use for your military use. Oh, and by the way, I also paint. That's another thing. But I can do all these other things, which I think is just so interesting because he's known for being a great painter. He's established this, but clearly he wants to do other things. And it's almost like a footnote, like, oh yeah, by the way, I can paint and do some sculptures if you need it. But, here's all the other things I can do. So he has this letter. We don't know for sure if it was ever sent, but, he's seeing this. He's ready to go to Milan and he's ready to almost reinvent himself as, not just Leonardo, the painter. He's Leonardo, the I can do everything kind of guy.
And I think this is such a good point, and probably for our listeners, something to consider what makes Milan so different than Florence. We've talked about Florence at length. It's a republic. It's focused on banking, trade, the sense of civic pride. And again, like I said before, it's the birthplace of the Renaissance. It's, end to end filled with humanist ideals. It's focused on art, icons like Michelangelo. Florentine, architecture and art doesn't really serve as much of a political purpose as it does, say, when we compare it to somewhere like Milan, which is a duchy. It's ruled by the Sforza families, and it prioritized central authority, military innovation, and practical engineering. So a very stark contrast between the two. Its economy relied on agriculture, industry, and it really focused on fortifications in a very grand sense. And Milanese art often served very political purposes. It had a very Gothic style architecture like the Milan Cathedral, which again contrasts very starkly with Florence's kind of more elegant Renaissance artwork and architecture style.
Yeah, and Milan is this economic powerhouse, especially where it's located as well. It almost has to be a little bit more militaristic just based on the fact that the French are right there. You have a growing Germany at this time, Holy Roman Empire. All of these things are starting to become more prevalent. And, especially for somewhere like Milan, you are the stepping stone into Italy. And we'll see how that becomes a problem for Leonardo as, he makes his way into Milan. But yeah, you're right. It's a complete difference. And if, you really want to be in a familiar place, but a completely different place, Milan is the perfect opportunity for him. It's still Italy. They speak Italian. He's still going to be at home there, but he's also going to be able to do a lot of different things. And ultimately, if he can get in the Sforza's good books, he's going to have an unlimited number of opportunities to do different things. Whereas within Florence, it's a republic, which I'm doing in air quotes, with some really rich families like the Medici and that who kind of run things. But ultimately, there's some sort of pseudo-democratic process that a lot of things need to go through. And there's a lot of kind of different things that are going on and people fighting for power and not necessarily being able to do things that are the most practical for their city. Like you mentioned, they're trying to do things for the political spin, where in Milan, build me a cool cannon or build me, some sort of defense system for my city. And, hey, I'm not maybe going to get much fanfare for it, but when I win a battle, that's when I'm going to do really well for myself. So yeah, completely different world, but I think it's perfect for really what he's looking for.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. I think the way that I am kind of framing this in my mind right now, Florence was really just a great way to start his life from such an early age. It gave him such great skill set, perspective, experience. But then I think as he matures, and I think it's a very mature decision and a brave one, to leave the confines of Florence, which is the epicenter of and this cultural hub, to go to Milan to really, one, he's got to have this desire for greater opportunity. And more interestingly, it's funny because we think of Leonardo, we think of the Mona Lisa. We have this really quick association with art, but his time in Milan, as we'll see, is, and even to your point about his resume that he puts together, there's a serious need for diversification beyond art into the more practical realm of real world application and tools.
Yeah, I wonder if him being in Florence almost grounded him a little bit in a sense of, Florence is, yes, it's so open, all these new things are changing, but ultimately, like we said, artistically, it's a bit more conservative, and he's being forced to do certain things, paint in certain ways, and really made him focus on his craft, right? Yeah, I think you're right. I think it is so perfect for him at this point where he's able to kind of get grounded, build those skills, and now he's in Milan where he's got all these skills in his tool belt. And now he gets to go back to doing what he loves, which is exploration and trying a bunch of different things out, with when he gets to Milan.
And I think that's such a good point too. Like his time in Florence, from what I read, he likes to work very slowly, very diligently with extreme swaths of times dedicated to focus. And he doesn't really get that in Florence as much as he'd like. And even to his point of curiosity, we had mentioned some of the paintings, like the Adoration of the Magi. Well, other artists before him and during his time have also been commissioned to do the same paintings. So it happens quite a bit in this era where artists are commissioned to paint these scenes out of the Bible. So he's not really doing anything that innovative, in his mind, maybe, because even though he's doing it himself, there's 4 or 5 other notable pieces of art all trying to, capture the same biblical moment.
Yeah. And I really go back to that, I think, as being a key point. He can change things up, but ultimately it's the same core process. But I really go back to the dome in Florence. And I think, I feel like we need to do an episode on Brunelleschi at some point, but, he's able to build this dome. And that's something that Leonardo is seeing probably on a daily basis, of this dome sitting in the middle of Florence, and nobody was able to figure out for a long, long time until Brunelleschi was able to figure it out. And I think for Leonardo, I think they worked on putting I think it was there's like a ball at the very top. That was kind of the last piece that went on. He was actually part of one of the teams that kind of helped put it together. And so it's like he's seeing things up close and personal. He's able to just really see the glory of this thing that's so prevalent in the city. And you definitely can see, that's the kind of stuff that I want to do. I want to build things that lasts forever outside of just a painting, and I want to do different things. But ultimately, he just wants to do a bunch of different cool stuff. So I think that's why going to Milan is such a perfect spot for him. But I think, we are getting up to the hour mark, and we did say we were going to cut this in 2 parts. And so this is, I think, a perfect stopping off point where, we have Leonardo, the seasoned painter who knows a lot of things, who's written a resume about, here's all the things I can do for you. And oh yeah, by the way, I paint. It's going to be a very different world for him in Milan. And I think one that he really was, I think he ends up looking back on his decision as a very good one for himself. And he's able to do a lot of cool things, but life takes you in different directions, and we'll see him go to Milan, leave, come back, and then eventually end up in France near the end of his life. So we'll talk all about that next time. But I think that's a good starting point on Leonardo's life.
Awesome. Great wrap up. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the History in Motion podcast. If you enjoyed our journey through time, please subscribe, rate us, and share the podcast with friends. Your support helps keep history alive. Until next time.